I always like to end a class by circling back to the beginning, so I've pulled together some highlights from our journey this semester. If you can remember all the way back to August, we started this course by discussing learning on the one hand and learning technologies on the other. Our goal was to develop an understanding of learning that would help us as we approach the design of digital environments. And as you know by now, that's what instructional design is really all about: understanding human learning, the role that digital media can play in learning, and solving the puzzle of how we can use what we know about how people learn to help us design the most effective possible learning resources. When we talked about learning, we discussed the idea that there are different kinds of learning appropriate for different situations, and different philosophies of learning, which may have different kinds of learning goals associated with them. For example, the behaviorist approach suggests that learning should be understood in terms of stimuli and responses. Even though behaviorism often gets a bad rap, there are times that stimulus and response is actually just what we want. For example, we want paramedics to react quickly and accurately when they're responding to a medical emergency, and we want students to become fluent with tasks like recognizing letters and words. Cognitivism is more concerned with thought processes. What's happening in the brain during learning? What factors enable us to remember and use new information? And at the other end of the learning philosophy spectrum is the constructivist approach. Constructivism suggests that learning is subjective and very personal, that each person must construct knowledge in his or her own way, and so learning is most meaningful when learners are free to explore. We talked about different ways of categorizing learning, such as Bloom's taxonomy. We then zeroed in to look at the cognitivist explanation of how information is processed by the learner. We looked at how information is perceived and held briefly in sensory memory, how it moves to working memory, and then hopefully is encoded into long-term memory. Because working memory is the place where the work of thinking takes place, this idea that working memory is extremely limited in its capacity is very important to our goal of designing effective instructional materials. We talked about how we store and retrieve information, including the idea of dual coding, that we can store information in both verbal and nonverbal formats, and that this can help us when it comes time to recall information because we have two ways of accessing that information. And also, schemas. These little packages of information help us make the best use of our limited working memories by bundling information together. The idea of cognitive load, that there's a limit to how much of a burden our working memories can carry, turned out to be critical to thinking about how we approach teaching through digital materials. We talked about three different types of cognitive load: intrinsic, which has to do with how difficult the material is; germane, which has to do with the cognitive work we have to perform in order to learn; and extraneous load, which just gets in the way and can come from poorly designed materials. The idea of cognitive load is then critical for developing the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This theory also helps us to think about how we can design appropriate materials, and we did a lot of reading in the Cambridge Handbook to learn more about the many principles derived from cognitive theory of multimedia learning that have been developed and that again can help guide the design of learning materials. Hopefully you came to appreciate the value of the information in the pages of that text. As we discussed these principles, these strategies, these learning environments, we also talked about the idea of backing up claims with evidence. We always need to have good reasons for our design decisions, solid reasons based on evidence. This is actually one of the big ideas in this course, that theories are, well, that they're not just theoretical, but they actually can and should influence our design decisions. So in your final projects this semester, you've hopefully brought all these elements together. You've thought about what it is you're trying to teach and who you're teaching it to, how the learning resource should look, how it should function, and most of all, why it should be designed in a particular way. As you continue through the program, you'll be continuing to develop both your hard skills: how do you actually produce a website or a video or an online course, but you'll also be developing your skill in thinking like an instructional designer. How do you think in a theoretical way about design so that this way of thinking becomes almost automatic for you? How do you apply these principles to create the most effective and engaging learning resources that you can? I just wanted to say I've been impressed by each one of you, by the work that you've produced and the energy you put into it. I've enjoyed working with you, and I look forward to continuing to work together.